Hello and welcome. My name is Hugh Farquhar and I am the CEO of WatchKeeper. I am delighted to be presenting today's launch from the SciViz Experience Centre in London. SciViz is a technology leader in visualization solutions for mission-critical environments, such as control rooms and global security operations centres. So there is no better place to be for the launch of our groundbreaking new unified situational awareness platform. The last year has been extremely challenging for many organisations. Not only has the pandemic changed how and where we work, but corporate security functions have often been the first line of defence in mitigating COVID-19 risks within their organisation. At the same time, the risk events we are more used to managing, such as tropical storms, wildfires, civil unrest, terrorism and violent crime, appear to be growing in frequency and severity. In 2020, there was a record $50 billion weather disaster events globally, compared to an average of 29 since 1990. This included record-breaking wildfires in Australia and California, the most active hurricane season on record with 30 named storms, and severe flooding in China, India and Japan, causing over $55 billion in damage. But 2020 was not an anomaly. From 2000 to 2019, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has reported that destructive storms increased by 40%, extreme weather events increased at 82%, and major flood events increased 134% compared to the period 1980 to 1999. And already this year, we have seen Cyclone Eloise cause widespread flooding across Mozambique and a polar vortex causing crippling power outages and water shortages in Texas. It is not about whether you believe climate change is responsible for these events or not. The data suggests these types of weather events are now the norm, not the extreme. A little later, James Byrne, a senior meteorologist for IBM's The Weather Company, will take your questions live and dig into the driving forces behind some of these adverse weather trends. The last year has also seen a surge in public disorder, some born out of frustration of lockdown measures implemented by governments the world over, but others more concerningly driven by growing inequality, the lack of government transparency, or the suppression of human rights. The pandemic has left most governments reeling under excruciating debt burdens. In fact, global debt is sitting at approximately $277 trillion, or 365% of world GDP. The IMF has reported that several countries, including Argentina, Lebanon and Ecuador, have already defaulted on their debt obligations, and a number of other countries, particularly in low-income countries, such as the DRC, Kenya, Mozambique and Tajikistan, are at high risk of debt distress. All the while, unemployment, food prices and infrastructure outages are likely to drive socio-economic unrest whilst governments struggle to balance their books. Henry Wilkinson, Chief Intelligence Officer at the Risk Advisory Group, will discuss the drivers of unrest in his outlook for 2021-22 as we move out of restrictive social gathering protocols. One would assume that lockdown measures during the pandemic would have lowered active shooter events in the United States. According to the Gun Violence Archive, sadly the opposite is true, with 2020 recording the highest number of mass shootings ever with 611 incidents compared to the previous record of 417 in 2019. Most worryingly, commercial and retail premises account for almost 50% of these attacks. Whilst terrorism in urban areas of developed countries continues to fall, overall global terrorism activity increased in 2020, focused around conflict zones or remote areas where the authorities struggle to monitor and respond proactively. The concern has to be that as the world reopens from the pandemic, the concentration risk of individuals in public areas could see an increase in successful attacks in major urban cities. This was evidenced by the string of attacks in France at the end of 2020 as lockdown measures were eased. In a moment, our keynote speaker, Ali Soufan, will give his threat assessment on how global terrorism risk will evolve as people return to offices, transport hubs, and hospitality venues. Ali will also join our panel alongside Henry and James to take your question on any domestic or international terrorism topics. And on that note, in order to submit a question in time for the panel Q&A, please just type it into the chat functionality at the bottom of your Zoom call screen, starting with the name of the panel member you primarily want to address it to, and we will get through as many of them as possible. So where does WatchKeeper fit into your security operations? In our conversations with global security teams over the last year, many have felt overwhelmed by the complexity of risks with little extra resources allocated to help manage the increased workload. Three primary themes reoccurred. How can we access all our data and utilize it better to make critical decisions faster? How can we leverage technology to simplify how we monitor and respond to adverse events? And how can we collaborate more effectively as a team? The problem is that monitoring and responding to adverse events is a slow, manual, and error-prone process of cross-referencing multiple systems and databases. Event alerts or intelligence from your risk vendors or from public warning sources often sits on disparate platforms, and information on where assets, employees, or critical business functions are located is often siloed in different internal departments. Incident notification and reporting is also not always an automated process. Decision makers rarely have all the information at hand to make critical decisions that could save lives or millions in operational losses. Crisis management is complicated further by fragmented communication methods between centralized security operation teams and on-the-ground responders. WatchKeeper's platform allows organizations and government agencies to achieve complete situational awareness by synchronizing internal data sources and external risk feeds on a single mapping display. WatchKeeper's APIs pull in events in real time from IoT sensors such as for earthquakes, tsunamis and flooding, and from elite risk monitoring providers such as social media aggregators for high impact events and political risk companies. In essence, we can ingest, map, monitor and alert on any system that has network connectivity or any data set that has a location marker. As you are about to see, we believe we have developed a modern platform that is sleek, intuitive, and highly practical to use. It is made with small, under-resourced security teams in mind, but at the same time scales to meet larger global security operations center requirements, such as the environment I'm standing in today. Unlike other providers, WatchKeeper works straight out of the box and does not require any other software or services to run effectively. Moreover, the platform is also incredibly performant, built on the latest cloud-based software technologies. Customers can access the platform via our secure AWS cloud, or being cloud agnostic, we can deploy it on-premise with low integration costs. WatchKeeper is also vendor agnostic. We are not an intelligence or risk data provider, which means we can work with any risk vendors without any concerns of conflict of interest. This gives us the ability to offer a more seamless experience between your vendor platforms and what you see in WatchKeeper. And in the next few months, we'll be making some very exciting announcements around enhanced functionality that you will not find in any other platform from some of the industry's leading risk vendors. All of this is offered at a fair price to a security market we recognize is under difficult budgetary restraints. That is why WatchKeeper is priced in tiers, so you can get started quickly and upgrade in phases as your team becomes more familiar with the platform and more features and data is required. And to celebrate our launch, we commit to offering the most competitive price against like-for-like systems throughout 2021. With that in mind, I'm excited to show you the new WatchKeeper platform. I'm sure you can all see from that demo how powerful WatchKeeper can be in helping you monitor and respond more effectively to high-impact events in real time. But it's not just the WatchKeeper platform we are launching today. We are also rolling out our brand new website which is focused on how the platform works for all areas of your security operations. It also gives details on specific features, pricing, and our story as a company. Go check it out at watchkeeper.com. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ali Soufan. Ali is chairman of the Soufan Group and a former FBI supervisory special agent who is involved in a number of high-profile anti-terrorism cases both in the United States and around the world. He investigated the East Africa US Embassy bombings in 1998, the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000, and the events surrounding 9/11. A New Yorker article described Ali as coming closer than anyone to preventing the September 11th attacks and implied that he would have been successful had the CIA been more willing to share information with him. I'm also sure he won't mind me mentioning, but this story is portrayed in the excellent television series, The Looming Tower. Ali is also the author of Anatomy of Terror, From the Death of Bin Laden to the Rise of the Islamic State, and the New York Times bestseller, The Black Banners, the inside story of 9/11 and the war against Al-Qaeda. In its original release in 2011, many of the most significant passages were redacted, but after a decade of legal wrangling, the full story is now available. Ali, thank you for joining us today. It is a privilege to have you speak at WatchKeeper's launch event about the threat of terrorism as society opens up after the COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you.
Good morning from the United States and good afternoon to those in the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. It is my pleasure to join you all today for the launch of WatchKeeper's international new platform. In these complex and uncertain times, it's invaluable to have a tool for monitoring global crises and the intersection between violent events, natural disasters, and public health emergencies. 1 year into the global pandemic, no corner of the world has remained unharmed. The worldwide coronavirus death toll has surpassed 2.5 million lives. We have witnessed a global economic slowdown as countries move to lockdown to protect their citizens and contain the deadly pandemic. Several economic sectors will be impacted for years to come: trade, education, travel and transportation, tourism, hospitality, entertainment, and many others. We have witnessed a global shift to the online space as businesses and other entities pivoted to virtual and remote operations. Unfortunately, throughout the pandemic, we have continued to see terrorist organizations, extremist movements, and violent individuals capitalize and thrive in this climate. Extremist recruitment and propaganda have proliferated. The online space is riddled with hateful content, extremist propaganda, and conspiracy theories. In the United States, we have seen communities targeted and victimized, to include violent attacks against Asian Americans, increased anti-Semitism, and a rise in domestic violence incidents. Within this context, I will focus on 3 key areas and how they are likely to impact a global post-pandemic terrorism threat landscape. First, the threat from Salafi jihadi-inspired terrorism. Second, the threat from the far right and violent white supremacy. And third, the rise of conspiracy theories and disinformation. To begin, we must keep our eyes on the enduring threat from Salafi jihadi-inspired terrorism. Diminished by law enforcement and military operation and the COVID-19 pandemic, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda continue to pose a lingering threat. Very little impact have been made to confront the ideology and narrative of such groups. Thus, their threat still remains. Further, both the so-called Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are increasingly acting through regional affiliates embedded in local dynamics and conflicts, rather than their centralized operational core. Although ISIS has lost territorial control and Al-Qaeda much of its leadership, both retain significant influence and operational capabilities through regional affiliates. in West Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Sahel, Islamic State affiliates continue to cooperate and destabilize the region. We also see upticks in violence and destabilization along the southeastern Swahili coast in Tanzania and Mozambique. In Afghanistan, where cooperation between Taliban and Al Qaeda may be affected by ongoing peace talks, the Islamic State Khorasan province may be able to peel away hardliners dissatisfied with the reconciliation. The impact of COVID 19 introduced several uncertainties regarding the trajectory of Salafi jihadist inspired terrorism. In Europe, for example, the past few years have seen more low tech, low cost attacks perpetrated by individuals or small groups without direct affiliations with a group like Al Qaeda or ISIS. This trend continued, with individuals or smaller groups carrying out recent attacks in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. With pandemic restrictions limiting movements and access to targets, large scale attacks have not been likely. However, this period of relative quiet may provide opportunities for planning and preparing for sophisticated attacks when the restrictions are lifted and when the public begins gathering again at markets, at concerts, and festivals. As restrictions are eased in the West, companies and urban areas will need to remain vigilant with regards to mass transit, public gatherings, and other spaces vulnerable to mass casualty attacks, including soft targets like shopping centers. From a global business perspective, companies will also need to remain vigilant about new areas of concerns where local security situations may have deteriorated over the course of the pandemic, to include tourism and business travel to locations like Mozambique or Tanzania or other regions formerly less associated with Salafi jihadist inspired terrorism. Second, the rise of threat from far right and violent white supremacy. The entire Western world, from North America to Europe to Australia and beyond, must take seriously the rising threat from violence instigated by white supremacists and other far right violent extremists. In a post pandemic world, we face disadvantages when addressing this challenge. The United States and much of Western Europe and the world spent the past 2 decades almost singularly focused on the threat posed by Salafi jihadism. Government and security agencies have been less prepared in responding to this challenge. Also, we have long had a double standard in counterterrorism, even though violence is violence and terrorism is terrorism. The attacks in Norway in 2011 and Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019 have invited closer scrutiny on global white supremacy extremism. This scrutiny reveals that, like the global jihadist movement, violent white supremacists and far right actors maintain international linkages and continue to forge global networks, with ideologue radicalizing individuals across the globe. Both Andres Breivik and Brenton Tarrant drew inspiration from grievances and causes originated in other countries, while each presented himself as a defender of global European white civilization. We have seen the conflict in Ukraine emerging as a hub in the broader network of transnational white supremacy extremism, attracting foreign recruits from all over. Where jihadis once traveled to fight in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, white supremacists create their own theater in which to network, build relations, and learn combat. This place is Ukraine, where the conflict between pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian government forces has been ongoing since 2014, attracting fighters from around the globe who are taking advantage of the Ukrainian conflict for their own aims and goals. So, what can we expect in a post pandemic world from this threat? A chief concern is increased networking, fundraising, and recruiting. For example, Over the pandemic, these extremists will have forged strong online relationships, and they are likely to want to take those relationships a step further through meetups and opportunities to bond and plot in person. Another concern is that reopening will provide space again for these groups and individuals to convene at international events. Previously, we have seen activities like mixed martial arts, MMA clubs, neo-Nazi music festivals, and ultra-nationalist commemorations and events provide pretext for extremists from all over the world to gather and gain strength. As our societies and businesses look forward to returning to normal, we should be concerned about an emboldened and transnational far-right threat. This was most dramatically illustrated at the events of January 6 in Washington, D.C. during the storming of the U.S. Capitol building. However, events before and after that day showed an increased momentum among domestic U.S. violent extremist groups and growing transnational connections among white supremacy extremists. Although the insurrection was unsuccessful in attaining its objectives, far-right violent groups across the world have lauded the effort and seen the attempt as a seed for potential future models. The imagery from that day may serve as a critical inspiration for violent far-right extremists worldwide. 3. The threat from conspiracy theories and disinformation. The widespread disinformation campaigns about COVID-19, about 5G technology, anti-vaccination, about QAnon, among many others, may give rise to more violent anti-government movements. In the US, we have seen the worrying intersection between conspiracy theories and calls for violence and domestic terrorism. Furthermore, we could also see heightened discrimination targeting communities in some way associated with the effects of the pandemic, including healthcare workers or advocates or government proponents of preventive measures. A COVID-19 testing center was recently bombed in the Netherlands. Protests have been staged to disrupt vaccination clinics in the US. As communities are falsely and maliciously linked to these conspiracy theories, they become more vulnerable to attack, as we have witnessed with the Asian American community in the United States and the increased threat against Jewish houses of worship and community centers that is directly connected to the rise of anti-Semitism. At the same time, with young people increasingly spending more time online, violent extremist groups across the ideological spectrum have further opportunities to spread their narrative, to recruit, and even to mobilize. Finally, nearly 2 decades after the attacks of September 11, 2001 in the United States, the global terrorism landscape looked more diffuse and diverse. A centralized core of transnational groups have today been replaced with networks, with regional affiliates, and with more ideologically diverse violent groups. This complex terrorism landscape is further compounded by civil unrests and the devastating impact of natural disasters, which will each be addressed by my co-panelists later in this event. As communities continue to reel from social, economic, and personal losses, violent extremist groups can further capitalize on the soaring societal and economic losses from the pandemic. Against that backdrop, businesses and companies developing plans and processes for a return to business as usual and to national and international business travel and operations must be mindful of this evolution. Our post-pandemic response must reflect the reality of the threat as it exists today, not as it was a year ago. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali, and it's brilliant to have you with us today. And some really interesting topics there, which I'm sure our audience are going to want to dig into in some detail. Before we get started, just a reminder that if you wish to submit a question, then please type it in the chat box on your Zoom controls with the name of the panelist that you wish to address it to. And just before we get started with questions, I wanted to introduce our other two panelists. Henry Wilkinson is the Chief Intelligence Officer at the Risk Advisory Group. He has overall responsibility for the group's worldwide political and security intelligence gathering, risk and threat assessments, and analytical products and services. He is also often called upon to advise government committees on foreign policy and international security risks. We are also joined today by James Byrne, a senior meteorologist and solutions engineer at IBM's The Weather Company. James spent much of his career working for the oil and gas industry, forecasting weather for offshore activities, so knows a thing or two about destructive weather on business operations. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm only sorry that we couldn't be there in person and do this with more of a live audience. Ali, I want to turn to you first. You touched in your kind of comments just a moment ago upon ISIL affiliates operating throughout the sub-Saharan and East Africa region. How concerned should Western interests in those regions be about these groups? Do they have the funding, resources, capabilities to launch large-scale operations as we've seen in the past with Al-Qaeda's US embassy bombings, or Al-Shabaab's Westgate shopping mall attack, or Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb's attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel in Mali?
Again, thank you for including me with this great panel and for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. Yes, I think we need to keep that threat. We need to think about it very seriously. As you know, for example, ISIS affiliates in Nigeria and northern Nigeria are very active. We see activities happening in many different countries in northern Nigeria. We see Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and also affiliates of ISIS operating in a Sahel region. We've seen them taking hostages, for example, in different areas, negotiating, with the French and other countries, the release of these hostages. The focus of these groups now has been local, but it does not mean that they cannot go suddenly against Western targets when the opportunity presents itself, or when they start focusing on the far enemy, as they call the West and the US, rather than the near enemy. They have a strategy now, and their strategy is very local in nature. They are trying to take advantage of the chaos that exists in order to prevent anyone else from providing an opportunity to create stability. And that is part of their strategy. And I talk a lot about this in Anatomy of Terror, about the management of savagery that these groups have. And basically the management of savagery is, first you do terrorist attacks to create vacuums, and after you create that vacuum, you prevent anyone from filling that vacuum. You build alliances with local groups that they will turn to you for social services, for medical care, for a lot of these things that frankly Al-Qaeda and different groups are providing in Africa and that region, both in East Africa and in West Africa and in the Sahel. And then after that, you establish a state, and then you connect all these states together with a caliphate. When it first came out that management of savagery, it was laughable. But as Charles de Gaulle said, if you want to understand the world, look at the map. And if you see what they are doing now in these different areas, all the way from West Africa, through Sahel, East Africa, Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, what's going on in the Levant with the different groups, what's going on in Iraq, all the way to Afghanistan with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Khorasan, then their strategies start to make more sense. So we need to be very careful about the threat. The threat, just because it's not being reported about much in Western media and in the United States, it does not mean that it does not exist.
Yeah, and a worrying outlook for the years to come, certainly, as we kind of start getting back into kind of public spaces. Henry, I just wanted to turn to you kind of next. You're kind of going to be giving a bit of insight here as to the civil unrest risks around the world and certainly the increase that we've seen. A lot has happened over the last year in terms of demonstrations and public disorder. We've obviously had the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-lockdown protests, Indian farmers' rights, and the current disturbing scenes in Myanmar following the military coup. I know it's a tall order to kind of distill all of that into what is kind of a short panel session, but what are some of the kind of key themes and trends you are seeing from your analytical work?
Yes, Thank you, Hugh, and thank you very much for having me, and congratulations on the launch of your platform. I mean, the last year has clearly been extraordinary, and if you cast your eyes over what's been going on from a civil unrest perspective, it's quite an interesting mixed picture, really. I mean, the disruptive protests and civil unrest remained common in 2020, even under COVID-19 related restrictions on movements and gatherings. But the fate of a lot of political protest campaigns has been pretty mixed. New campaigns clearly emerged in the US, Thailand, and Belarus, and others in Latin America. Whereas campaigns in Asia and parts of Europe also ground to a halt, just as some examples. So I think one of the key points, I guess, and perhaps it's a rather obvious point, is that with lockdown in effect, we really are certainly in Europe as an example, in a rather suspended state. It's an artificial state. The suppression of movement, controls of movement, really just means that a lot of pent-up grievances are there. We are seeing protests, of course, around things like lockdowns and various other issues, but these are often pretty small and contained. So for us, the big concern really is right now there's a concern that with the immense economic impacts that you've spoken about, driving grievances, energizing pre-existing grievances, political ideologies on the left and the right, the conflation of conspiracy theories, as Ali was talking about, which is very important, I think, to talk about in this. The concern is that really what we're talking about is a high degree of latency, that as we, in the Northern Hemisphere in particular, move into the summer months and restrictions start to ease, particularly with mass vaccination programs, you're going to have a tide of unrest that suddenly starts to come about. And I think that is a particularly concerning point, because obviously when people start to gather and are able to do that, that represents a real challenge. At the flip side, that also seems like quite a foreseeable kind of risk, I think, to many governments. And so on the inverse, there's also the concern that while there's so many controls in place, will governments be reluctant to ease controls in anticipation of this kind of unrest? Are we likely to see a furtherance of the pre-existing trend of authoritarianism around the world? Obviously, we've seen, as you say, disturbing events in Myanmar, but we're also seeing knock-on effects where other governments appear to be behaving in a much more coercive and controlling fashion, because they're worried, of course, that the long tail, even the short tail risks of the pandemic are going to bite. So it's a difficult picture to really sort of portray. It's very, very mixed. But I would say that what is clear is that the economic impacts are immense. The social impacts have been immense. Governments are less able to deal with the issues because they are obviously being affected, and their ability to really alleviate the pain, I guess, that a lot of the grievances that people have is very limited. So we're potentially entering into a very restive and very controlling state at the same time, I think is a broad overview.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. James, just turning to you from a kind of weather perspective, I referenced in my opening remarks how extreme weather events have smashed records over the last few years, and how the longer term trends of are seeing these events occur at greater frequency and severity. Is there any reason why we shouldn't be expecting similar record-breaking years of extreme weather in the coming years? James, I think you're on mute, James.
Classic Zoom call there. I'm on mute. Okay, can we hear him now?
Got you.
So you're asking what's the global long-term forecast for extreme weather, and I think the short answer is going to be worse. It's going to get worse. So I mean, my proudest moment before I worked offshore was my academic highlight was a paper I published in my master's dissertation, was used as part of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that was looking at extremes of weather. This was many years ago, so I followed the stats since then. We were on an upward trajectory climate-wise. Whether that's human or not, I don't know. People have their opinions on that, but as the planet gets warmer, we're getting more extreme weather, and that's undeniable. The other interesting thing as well is the impact as well on society, because we've got a greater population. So if you look at some of the impact statistics as well, those are bad as well. So yeah, fortunately we have better forecasts. We have things like WatchKeeper to try and mitigate for the impact as well. But yeah, the long-term forecast is not good, I think. Well, good for WatchKeeper and the wider company maybe, but hopefully we can mitigate for the long-term trends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what it's really about. Kind of our business is really helping organizations get ahead of the risks before they occur. Ali, just turning back to you, and a couple of people have kind of brought this up on the chat as a question already. You spoke at length in your keynote speech about the threat from far-right extremists. What threat do these individuals or groups pose to the corporate security sector? Or is it predominantly government assets that are likely to be targeted, as seen with the storming of the Capitol building, Anders Breivik in Norway, and Timothy McVeigh with his bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma back in 1995?
Well, it's yet to be seen. So far, any terrorist attacks, like something that we've seen, for example, conducted by such groups in Norway or in Christchurch in New Zealand, or even the storming of the Capitol building, it will have a significant impact on the society and will definitely impact also companies. So a terrorist attack is not going to discriminate between people who are working for the government versus people who are probably working in the company next door. As we've seen in the UK and we've seen in the US, there were attacks, and we continue to see attacks on 5G infrastructure, for example. Some people believe that 5G has really harmful effect on the public. They have harmful effect it spread COVID. There's a conspiracy out there on this, and they are attacking 5G things. And this is not government. This is private companies who owns these towers. So it's yet to be seen with COVID and with the lockdown that we have. But so far, we started to see attacks not only against governments. We see attacks against houses of worships, against synagogues, for example, or Jewish centers. We've seen attacks against the members of the, Asian American community, and immigrants. We've seen an attack at Walmart, for example, in Texas. It killed many Hispanic Americans and residents. So yeah, terrorism is terrorism, and I don't think the attacks is going to be only focusing on government, as we've seen from the telecommunication industry, the medical industry, the attacks in Walmart, the attacks in Christchurch. Terrorism, basically, whatever targets they have, they will go ahead and do it.
So just to follow up on that, because a lot of people that are on this call are obviously kind of from corporate security functions. Do companies need to reposition their kind of security strategies to deal with a more domestic threat? Is the insider threat for companies growing significantly?
Yeah, absolutely. The insider threat is definitely growing, and we see that not only with industrial espionage, especially within the great power competition between China and Russia and the US. But also we've seen that from the shootings that we have, the different attacks at some companies and medical, pharmaceutical industries and so forth. So I think the rise of white supremacy and the rise of domestic terrorism, as we call it in the United States, even though it's connected to a transnational network at this point, that domestic threat is not domestic anymore. I think we have to take it seriously, and it's still at the early stages. I think they are today where the jihadis were in the 90s, but I think if we pay attention to it and if we dealt with it in appropriate manners and didn't mess it up like we messed the early on the fight against the jihadis, I think we'll be able to mitigate this kind of threat. However, this is something that everybody needs to take seriously. As we've seen, these attacks are happening. It's not like something we're talking about, something is going to happen. And I can only imagine when there is ease in movement and travel, what this is going to happen. I mean, you have to connect it also with what the colleagues on the panel are saying. For example, the economic disparities here that we see in the West and the United States, the fear of immigrants that they are taking their jobs. A lot of the economic impact has a lot to do with this. These white supremacist groups and ultra-right groups are actually capitalizing on these economic, societal, and political spheres. Also, what we see, in a way, with climate change, a lot of these conflicts have something to do with climate change. For example, you mentioned, Sahel and West Africa before. Many of the conflicts that's happening, let's say in Mali, it's between the herders and the farmers, and it's actually fighting over resources and fighting over water, where the government is taking one side and Al-Qaeda is taking the other side. Same thing we see in Afghanistan. Same thing we see in Yemen. Sana'a is probably the first capital that's run out of water, or is going to be running out of water. This extreme climate issues, change is creating waves and waves of migration. These migrants are coming to the West. These extremist groups in the West don't want to see brown people or Asian people who are ever coming to their society and changing the nature of the society. So I like the topics that you have on this panel, because all of these things are so interconnected with each other. And we've been focusing a lot on climate change and terrorism, all type of terrorism, all type of violence. And actually the Pentagon a few years ago put a paper about the impact on climate change of the future of national security, even for the United States and even for the US military. So these things we have to keep in mind, because all of them are so intertwined with each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, we've got a question that's been submitted, which I'll get back to in just a moment on, which is talking about that nexus between climate change and how people might exploit that. Henry, just turning to you. At WatchKeeper, we put a poll out the other day amongst some of our clients, asking which physical security risk posed the greatest threat to their operations and employees in 2021: civil unrest, terrorism, violent crime, or natural disaster. Over 50% of the respondents chose civil unrest. If we all know it's coming, as you've just kind of detailed as well there, what can security managers do to better protect their organizations?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and obviously it's a question that needs answering in a very specific context, which is that many companies, many corporate security teams will be overseeing workforces that are still working from home. So you have a slightly different equation, whereas once maybe you were particularly concerned about your employees going into work and being caught up in bouts of unrest near their offices. Now they're working from home, they're probably less exposed. So in some ways, it's actually a bit less of a problem, I guess, from a practical operational security risk management standpoint. But I think in terms of active measures that one can take, I think the most important thing is to really get ahead of the problem and really get into the detail and really understand what kind of flashpoints are coming up. I think tying risk assessments and forecasts and intelligence analysis about what kind of protests are coming up, what kind of what the ideological motives are of the protesters, what sort of locations are they going to target. Obviously that's fairly standard fare, but you can also then start to run that against data and information that you have around restrictions, coronavirus restrictions and lockdown, so you can start to see a convergence. And I think I know, speaking certainly with the law enforcement community that I have, certainly in Europe, you can see that there are quite significant concerns around the easing of restrictions and the explosion of unrest, and a lot of causes that may have come off the boil. I mean, for example, one might be climate change. Obviously, people are very concerned about that. We're talking about the weather. But a lot of climate change activist groups, for example, simply haven't had the opportunity to gather and press home their message, and I'm sure that they feel that this is a burningly urgent issue. And so I think it's pretty reasonable to foresee that you'll start to see an intensified campaigning around that. And and other issues, lockdown, grievances, obviously there's a bit, it's interesting as well, the max vaccination programs. I think there's another area where that might be a particular source of grievance. If you look at how the programs are rolling out, some are very successful and effective. Britain seems to be doing pretty well, but other countries are going to get left behind, and I think that will be a very acute source of grievance, as people feel that they're seeing the rest of the world pulling away, but they're still stuck in lockdown. And I think looking more globally, that kind of frustration will probably become particularly pronounced and really exacerbates how people feel about their government and how they're running things. So an intelligence-led approach is obviously, I guess I would in my position, but I would absolutely advocate that. But I think it's important to sort of tie this in terms of planning around where are people protesting, how do we plan our return to work strategy, how does that correlate with the mass vaccination strategy, and actually having a proper planning basis for it. And then I think using tools, like WatchKeeper is a really good example. If you've got that real-time information, you can really track it, making sure that you're able to divert people away from these, any incidents that may be occurring as a sort of fully integrated strategy.
It's interesting just to pick up on something you kind of said there around kind of from a corporate security perspective, right? People aren't in centralized places like offices, but I think there's an argument, and I'd like your kind of insights into this, that actually it's become more complicated now, right? So instead of 8,000 people being in a building in Canary Wharf or in Manhattan, there's now 8,000 people in 8,000 different buildings around the kind of inner London or kind of New York area. And doesn't duty of care extend out to kind of people's homes now that we're in this new kind of environment of working from home?
That's absolutely right. And of course, the surface area has increased exponentially with everybody working from home in terms of the surface area that in theory one is trying to protect. And yes, of course, the home becomes the workplace. And there's other factors as well to take into account. I mean, if it's plausible that we're likely to see significant civil unrest, and when I say that, I'm talking about things like riots, and the impact that can have on communities and the sense of fear that can have as law enforcement gets drawn and goes and deals with the unrest, and you get areas which are neglected, particular problem in urban spaces. People can feel very unsafe and they remain in a situation where they can't necessarily move and they need information. I mean, these are very complex challenges, and I think some of the solutions that are really important to sort of take into account are, one, obviously, as I say, getting ahead of the problem and really thinking through how that plays out. Do you know where your people are? I mean, obviously you have their home addresses, but how do you communicate to them? Let them know that there's something in their particular locality. If you're just concerned about unrest in the downtown area where you have your office, it's a bit easier to manage that. But you're right, if you have people scattered to the winds, you may have multiple locations where there's unrest potentially going off. And you need to communicate in those areas. So it does become a very complex problem, and this is where technology can really play a big difference.
Indeed. James, just coming down to you from a weather perspective, I think one of the greatest challenges I have, right, around weather is that there's all this terminology, right? There's El Nino, there's kind of Derico, there's polar vortexes, etc. And the press love those types of words to kind of throw about and sling about. Can you give us some insight as to kind of, for instance, what El Nino does to kind of the weather patterns throughout the planet, and how it may cause some of these more extreme events?
Well, so, I mean, all of these sort of meteorological terms, and I'll be honest, I these days spend more time playing with just the data and wiring different weather data feeds to help. And I put my trust in the science and the modelers. And actually within the IBM model, we include input from actual meteorologists as well. And these operational people are the people that are following, is it an El Nino year? Is it, is ENSO up at the moment? So they look at these types of things and then adjust in the short term, the models, the forecast that we actually produce. But yeah, it is hard because you almost do a battle against what the media are trying to, because they love a specific event and a specific thing. They latch onto a specific thing that they'll kind of blow it out of proportion, and it sometimes doesn't help our jobs as the people who are just trying to, at the end of the day, communicate the data, communicate the the severity of the storm or the impact or the heat wave or the whatever the event is, and get that information across quickly. I've worked with weather data long enough now. I do put my trust in the models, the technology. IBM have our own weather model, but we also use the models from the different national Met agencies as well. We do like to work with these different data sources, and that's how we try and produce our forecasts. But it's it is complex. I suggest try and, for anyone listening who's interested in it, try and sort of scratch below the surface of what the media report, because they would. That's not necessarily. I don't know. I'm a scientist, of course. I want to educate people. Don't believe everything you read in the press, basically. But, yeah, some thoughts there.
Excellent. Thank you, James. I just want to remind everyone, if you've got a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to submit it in the chat functionality of Zoom. It's a really good opportunity to ask what is, I think everyone agrees, a world-leading kind of panel of experts. Ali, just coming back to you, I was really interested to hear about your comments around Ukraine. And again, these are some of the themes we're seeing in some of the questions being submitted. We all know how slow Western governments were in reacting to Salafist jihadi-inspired individuals traveling to places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan for training. But in terms of Ukraine being used for far-right extremists to learn battlefield skills, as you alluded to, and given the complexities of the proxy war being fought over there, what can Western governments really do to not repeat the same mistakes of letting a theatre of war become a haven for extremists?
Well, Ukraine is a really interesting thing. Since the war started, we've seen extremists from basically all over the Western world going there. We've seen a lot of people actually traveling to Ukraine. Some of them are traveling to just join either side of the conflict. They have nothing to do with white supremacies. If you're ethnic Russians or ethnic Ukrainians, you're going to support your people and what you feel is just. But in the same time, we have a lot of white supremacy, individuals, white supremacists came from many Western countries and Scandinavian countries, and even as far as Australia and as New Zealand. There are reports that even the shooter from Christchurch actually went to Ukraine, and he took and then he traveled to Norway, and he took the permission for his operation from Berwick, who was in jail in Norway. So one of the things that we're seeing now, the new Ukrainian government has been very strict in allowing these folks to come through Ukraine. So it's very difficult for them now to go and take advantage of the conflict from the Ukrainian government side. However, in eastern Ukraine, the things are still open, and many people have been going and working and fighting and learning combat among Russian separatists. For example, the group that did the terrorist attack in Sweden against immigration camp. They were in eastern Ukraine, and they worked under the umbrella of the Russian Imperial Movement, the known white supremacist organization, and the only white supremacist organization that has been designated by the United States State Department as a terrorist organization. So one of the things that the West can do is pay attention to this phenomena very much so, like we started to pay attention after we had a lot of foreign fighters going to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Hold these individuals accountable, make it against the law to go and join white supremacists. Now, it is in many countries against the law to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda. However, there's still this big black hole in the system when it comes to white supremacies or neo-Nazi groups or far-right or whatever you want to call them. So we need to have policies, counterterrorism policies, that target terrorism regardless to race, regardless to religion, regardless to ethnicity. And that is unfortunately not happening in many countries around the world. Now, I have to admit Europe is way ahead of the US in this. For example, in the UK, there's no difference between a terrorist who belongs to white supremacy or who belongs to jihadi. MI5 had authorities to go recently, a couple of years ago, they got authorities to go against white supremacists in a very similar manner that they go against jihadis. Germany has been doing a lot in disrupting their activities, not only operationally, but also within law enforcement and within the military. And we always hear reports about what the German government are doing on this. Some other governments designated groups as terrorist organizations, to include Canada. Many of these groups that have been designated by the Canadian as terrorist organization are actually US-based group. The US, on the other hand, we're very different. We look at this very differently. We don't have domestic terrorism laws in the United States. So in order to use all the tools available to the intelligence and law enforcement to go after a group or an organization, that group or that organization has to belong to an international terrorist organization. So unfortunately, even when the UK and the Canadians and other Five Eye countries designate groups as terrorist organizations who are part of white supremacy, try to monitor their travel, try to monitor what they are doing. For example, if they go to Ukraine, who they work with, and so forth. And instead of doing that, the United States is now literally just looking the other way, and we are not dealing with our allies, in targeting these groups as a counter-terrorist threat, as the Canadians or the Brits or some of the Scandinavian countries or the Germans are doing. So we need to look into our system in the United States and try to figure out how can we add domestic terrorism, how can we enhance dealing with terrorism to include domestic terrorist groups like white supremacy, especially that more and more we start to see that these white supremacist organizations are part of a wider transnational network in very similar way as the jihadis are. And many people went from the US to join the fight in Ukraine, work with white supremacist organizations. You see it in some indictments, for example, in America. However, there's nothing we can do beyond that. This is the problem that we're having now. And this is what we need to focus on, not only Western countries, but specifically the United States.
Do you think, Ali, that law enforcement agencies, not only in the US, but around the world, are actually ill-equipped to deal with this kind of rising threat from far-right extremism? I mean, it kind of has slight superficial echoes of when you joined the FBI, right? And you were only, the 9th person in the FBI that actually spoke Arabic. Is law enforcement struggling to get hold of this issue?
I think so. And I think law enforcement is struggling on a totally different level in the United States because first, the numbers, second, these individuals and these groups are trying to take advantage of the partisan divide in order to make themselves more mainstream and more legitimate. And that makes law enforcement's job more complicated, especially if we don't have a common understanding as a nation regarding that threat. I think in Europe, we start seeing them moving more and more on finding ways to deal with it. But remember, with the jihadis, it was kind of like a little bit easier to figure out which communities they come from, where they are, their travel pattern. A lot of these things are monitored, but with the white supremacists, they can be anywhere. They can be your neighbor. They can be, so it's very difficult. They are really embedded in the society. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more complicated. And the white supremacy today is different than the neo-Nazi groups that we used to see before. It's not about the tattoos, and it's not about, the way you look and the swastikas you wear. Now they are trying to kind of like, take a cover of what they call the ultra-right or something else in order to create the ideology and the narrative, and then hoping that these different groups like the Atomwaffen or the Base or the Three Percenters or the Proud Boys or whatever, take advantage of this to recruit more and more. We see it in the United States, especially after the insurrection. We see more and more these groups on their channels that we monitor their channels and we see what they are talking about, saying, look, this is a great opportunity for us. Now we don't have, when we're recruiting people, we don't have to talk about the Nazis, about Hitler, about the Holocaust. The only thing we need to tell these megatards, that's what they call the mega crowd, the Make America Great Again crowd. They call them megatards. So the only thing we need to tell them that this is a fake election. Biden is not the real president, and now you have taxation without representation. And taxation without representation is basically it goes deep in our psyche in the United States. That's the reason we had the Revolutionary War in the first place. So they are reaching into deep issues in the American character, very much so, like the jihadis reach into deeper issues in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflicts, the war against Islam, and so forth. So we're seeing, I'm talking about a war against the white race, a war against Western civilization, very similar to the jihadis talking a war about Islam. One of them, the jihadis want a society that's pure religiously, the white supremacists wanted pure racially. Both, they justify violence, and both are actually learning from each other to the point that we have a neo-Nazi organization called the Base meaning Al-Qaeda. And they literally use Al-Qaeda manual, and they call for white jihad. So we see a lot of overlap, and I think we need to take these things very seriously and nip it in the bud at its early stages before it becomes a big problem. We don't need to wait for a white supremacist 9/11 in the world in order to wake up and smell the coffee of what's happening in Western societies.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of watch that evolve over the next couple of years, and how law enforcement kind of gets themselves up to speed in dealing with that threat. Henry, I just wanted to come to you. I spoke in my opening remarks about kind of how government debt is at kind of record-breaking levels at the moment, and how a number of countries around the world are already either defaulting on their debt obligations or at high risk of debt distress. This obviously kind of has the potential to lead to greater socio-economic risks, and especially kind of around food prices or kind of increases in fuel prices, etc. And with governments being able to kind of use the pandemic and lockdown as almost an excuse to kind of suppress protests or dissent, are we at risk of, when we come out of this phase of the pandemic, are we at risk of another Arab Spring style uprising in parts of Africa, the Middle East, or even Latam?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, the Arab Spring was obviously occurred in a particular context, but I guess the real question is, are we worried about contagion? I guess it's sort of another pandemic, if you give the turn of phrase. I mean, I certainly think that if you look at it, I mean, in terms of structural vulnerabilities, the world is immensely vulnerable to quite a lot of quite severe risks and crises, and the capacity of governments financially to deal with them is extremely limited, and actually makes them very vulnerable to seeking outside help and, I guess, external influence. And I guess we haven't really spoken too much about the geopolitics of things, but I think that is something that we absolutely have to have in our minds, around the fact that the pandemic has really laid bare not only the deep dysfunctions within societies, within states, but also between states. And as Ali said, everything's interlinked, and that's absolutely correct. And I think that there is a very serious risk of cascading and of external interventions to try and prop up governments or prevent crises in their own external interests. So yes, I think that is absolutely right. We've obviously seen, I mean, I think we're seeing it now in places like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, anxieties around the unrest from Myanmar spreading, as one example. We've seen North Africa as being particularly beset by unrests over the years and continues to suffer from significant governance issues and ongoing conflicts in Libya. But I mean, the underlying structural risks that I think gave rise to the Arab Spring, as the example that you pointed to, haven't really fundamentally been addressed. They just continue to be as they were, and if anything, they're exacerbated. I think the other thing that's really important to mention in all of this as well is that it's quite easy to look at the effects of the pandemic through a singular lens, what you may have in developed countries. But of course, the impact that it's had has been profoundly uneven and unequal. And there's in many ways, a bit like how the human body, which has comorbidities, is far more vulnerable to the impacts of the virus. So states with underlying comorbidities are far more vulnerable to the impacts of the pandemic. Weak governance, highly informalized economies where people aren't being bailed out, where there's huge inequalities already. And I think that it's not very difficult to really map out pretty quickly which countries in the world are looking immensely vulnerable, and will probably also be left behind when wealthier countries are vaccinated, are able to get back to business. You can just imagine the kind of resentments, the frustrations over governance. I mean, just as one example, look at Lebanon. You've got a country here which is in a deep economic crisis that was already there. The underlying governance issues were already apparent. The pathway forward for them is very, very hard to see. And you can just sort of see that the unrest is already playing out. They're blocking roads. And it's even crossing sectarian boundaries. Traditional political affiliations seem to be breaking down. People seem to be much less interested in the old political parties that have always had such a long grip there, just because the pressures are just so immense that people just feel incredibly desperate. So I think it's upending many things, and I think that is why the coming year is going to be immensely interesting, but I think immensely turbulent as well, because a lot of standing assumptions are probably going to get swept aside. That's my prediction.
Excellent. Thank you, Henry. I'm conscious of time, and so we'll probably leave it there. Apologies to people whose questions we didn't get to, but thank you very much to Ali, Henry, and James for joining. Ali, thank you also for your keynote speech. Some really interesting things, and I really hope that, or I'm sure that the audience has taken a lot away from today. If any of you on the call want to know a little bit more about Risk Advisory Group, IBM Weather, or of course WatchKeeper and the Soufan Group, then do get in touch with myself, and happy to make those introductions where necessary. Thank you to everyone who's joined, and we look forward to speaking with you all very shortly. Many thanks.